The letter of Aristeas, chapter 6, verse 65. He seemed to me to have made a good defense on all the points, for in reference also to the calves and rams and goats which are offered, he said it was necessary to take them from the herds and sacrifice tame animals and offer nothing wild, that the offerers of the sacrifices might understand the symbolic meaning of the lawgiver and not be under the influence of an arrogant self-consciousness. For he who offers a sacrifice makes an offering also of his own soul in all its moods. I think that these particulars with regard to our discussion are worth narrating, and on account of the sanctity and the natural meaning of the law, I have been induced to explain them to you clearly. Theocrats, because of your own devotion and learning. Chapter 7, the arrival of the envoys, with the manuscript of the precious book and gifts, preparations for a royal banquet. The host, immediately upon being seated at the table, entertains his guests with questions and answers, some sage comments on sociology. And this is 55 verses. And Eleazar, after offering the sacrifice and selecting the envoys and preparing many gifts for the king, dispatched us on our journey in great security. And when we reached Alexandria, the king was at once informed of our arrival. On our admission to the palace, Andreas and I warmly greeted the king and handed over to him the letter written by Eleazar. The king was very anxious to meet the envoys and gave orders that all the other officials should be dismissed and the envoys summoned to his presence at once. Now this excited general surprise, for it is customary for those who come to seek an audience with the king on matters of importance to be admitted to his presence on the 5th day, while envoys from the kings are very important cities with difficulty secure admission to the court in 30 days. But these men he counted worthy of greater honor, since he held their master in such high esteem, and so he immediately dismissed those whose presence he regarded as superfluous, and continued walking about until when they came, and he was able to welcome them. When they entered with gifts which had been sent with them, and the valuable parchments on which the law was inscribed in gold in Jewish characters, for the parchment was wonderfully prepared, and the connexion between the pages had been so effected as to be invisible. The king, as soon as he saw them, began to ask them about the books, and when they had taken the rolls out of their coverings and unfolded the pages, the king stood still for a long time, and then making obeisance about 7 times, he said, I thank you, my friends, and I thank him that sent you. Still more and most of all God, whose oracles these are. And when all the envoys and the others who were present as well shouted out at one time and with one voice, God save the king, he burst into tears of joy, for his exaltation of soul and the sense of the overwhelming honor which had been paid him compelled him to weep over his good fortune. He commanded them to put the rolls back in their places, and then after saluting the men, said, It was right, men of God, that I should first of all pay my reverence to the books for the sake of which I summoned you here, and then when I had done that, to extend the right hand of friendship to you. It was for that reason I did this first. I have enacted that this day on which you arrived shall be kept as a great day, and it will be celebrated annually throughout my lifetime. It happens also that it is the anniversary of my naval victory over Antigonus. Therefore, I shall be glad to feast with you this day. Everything that you may have occasion to use, he said, shall be prepared for you in a befitting manner, and for me also with you. After they had expressed their delight, he gave orders that the best quarters near the citadel should be assigned to them, and that preparations should be made for the banquet. And Nicanor summoned the Lord High Steward, Dorotheus, who was the special officer appointed to look after the Jews, and commanded him to make the necessary preparation for each one. For this arrangement had been made by the king, and it is an arrangement which you see maintained today. For as many cities as have special customs in the matter of drinking, eating, and reclining, has special officers appointed to look after the requirements, and whenever they come to visit the kings, preparations are made in accordance with their own customs in order that there may be no discomfort to disturb the enjoyment of their visit. The same precaution was taken in the case of the Jewish envoys. Now Dorotheus, who was the patron appointed to look after the Jewish guests, was a very conscientious man. All the stores which were under his control and set apart for the reception of such guests, he brought out for the feast. He arranged the seats in 2 rows in accordance with the king's instructions, for he had ordered him to make half the men sit at his right hand and the rest behind him, in order that he might not withhold from them the highest possible honor. When they had taken their seats, he instructed Dorotheus to carry out everything in accordance with the customs which were in use amongst his Jewish guests. Therefore he dispensed with the services of the sacred heralds and the sacrificing priests and the others who were accustomed to offer the prayers, and called upon one of our number, Eleazar, the oldest of the Jewish priests, to offer prayer instead. And he rose up and made a remarkable prayer. May Almighty God enrich you, O King, with all the good things which he has made, and may he grant you and your wife and your children and your comrades the continual possession of them as long as you live. At these words, a loud and joyous applause broke out, which lasted for a considerable time, and then they turned to the enjoyment of the banquet which had been prepared. All the arrangements for the service of the table were carried out in accordance with the injunction of Dorotheus. Among the attendants were the royal pages and others who held places of honor at the king's court. Taking an opportunity afforded by a pause in the banquet, the king asked the envoy who sat in the seat of honor, where they were arranged according to seniority, how he could keep his kingdom unimpaired to the end. After pondering for a moment, he replied, "You could best establish its security if you were to imitate the unceasing benignity of God. For if you exhibit clemency and inflict mild punishments upon those who deserve them in accordance with their deserts, you will turn them from evil and lead them to repentance." And that verse 33 is compared to the attitude towards criminals with the so-called modern humanitarian view. And it also relates to chapter 8, verse 11. It's also related to that. The king prays the answer, and then asks the next man how he could do everything for the best in all his actions. And he replied, "If a man maintains a just bearing towards all, he will always act rightly on every occasion, remembering that every thought is known to God. If you take the fear of God as your starting point, you will never miss the goal." The king complimented this man, too, upon his answer, and asked another how he could have friends like-minded with himself. He replied, "If they see you studying the interests of the multitudes over whom you rule, you will do well to observe how God bestows his benefits on the human race, providing for them health and food and all other things in due season." Further expressing his agreement with the reply, the king asked the next guest how in giving audiences and passing judgments he could gain the praise even of those who failed to win their suit. And he said, "If you are fair in speech to all alike, and never act insolently nor tyrannically, in your treatment of offenders. And you will do this if you watch the method by which God acts. The petitions of the worthy are always fulfilled, while those who fail to obtain an answer to their prayers are informed by means of dreams or events of what was harmful in the request, and that God does not smite them according to their sins or the strengthness of his strength, but acts with forbearance towards them. Now, what if God answers everybody's prayer, but answers it in different ways, and answers it perhaps with bestowal in the next life in some of the regards too? So, yeah. The king praised the man warmly for his answer and asked the next in order how he could be invincible in military affairs. And he replied, if he did not trust entirely to his multitudes or his warlike forces, but called upon God continually to bring his enterprises to a successful issue, while he himself discharged all his duties in the spirit of justice. Well, the spirit of justice, when that virtually eliminates war. Welcoming this answer, he asked another how he might become an object of dread to his enemies. And he replied, if while maintaining a vast supply of arms and forces, he remembered that these things were powerless to achieve a permanent and conclusive result, for even God instills fear into the minds of men by granting reprieves and making merely a display of the greatness of his power. This man the king praised, and then said to the next, what is the highest good in life? He answered, to know that God is Lord of the universe, and that in our finest achievements, it is not we who attain success, but God, who by his power brings all things to fulfillment and leads us to the goal. The king exclaimed that the man had answered well, and then asked the next how he could keep all his possessions intact and finally hand them down to his successors in the same condition. And he answered by praying constantly to God that you may be inspired with high motives in all your undertakings, and by warning your descendants not to be dazzled by fame or wealth. For it is God who bestows all these gifts, and men never by themselves win the supremacy. The king expressed his agreement with the answer and inquired of the next guest how he could bear with equanimity whatever befell him. And he said, if you have a firm grasp of the thought that all men are appointed by God to share the greatest evil as well as the greatest good, since it is impossible for one who is a man to be exempt from these, but God is to whom we ought always to pray, inspires us with courage to endure. Delighted with the man's reply, the king said that all their answers had been good. I will put a question to one another. He added, and then I will stop for the present, that we may turn our attention to the enjoyment of the feast and spend a pleasant time. Thereupon he asked the man, what is the true aim of courage? And he answered, if a right plan is carried out in the hour of danger in accordance with the original intention. For all things are accomplished by God to your advantage, O king, since your purpose is good. When all had signified by their applause their agreement with the answer, the king said to the philosophers, for not a few of them were present, it is my opinion that these men excel in virtue and possess extraordinary knowledge, since on the spur of the moment they have given fitting answers to these questions which I have put to them, and have all made God the starting point of the words. And Menedemus, the philosopher of Eretria, said, true, O king, since the universe is managed by providence, and since we rightly perceive that man is the creation of God, it follows that all power and beauty of speech proceed from God. When the king had nodded his assent to this sentiment, the speaking ceased, and they proceeded to enjoy themselves. When the evening came on, the banquet ended. Chapter 8, more questions and answers. Note verse 20 with its reference to flying through the air, written in 150 BCE, and this is 48 verses. On the following day, they sat down to table again, and continued the banquet according to the same arrangements. When the king thought that a fitting opportunity had arrived to put inquiries to his guests, he proceeded to ask further questions of the man who sat next in order to those who had given answers on the previous day. He began to open the conversation with the 11th man, for there were 10 who had been asked questions on the former occasion. When silence was established, he asked how he could continue to be rich. After a brief reflection, the man who had been asked the question replied, "If he did nothing unworthy of his position, never acted licentiously, never lavished expense on empty and vain pursuits, but by acts of benevolence made all his subjects well disposed towards himself. For it is God who is the author of all good things, and him man must needs obey." The king bestowed praise upon him, and then asked another how he could maintain the truth. In reply to the question, he said, "By recognizing that a lie brings great disgrace upon all men, and more especially upon kings, for since they have the power to do whatever they wish, why should they resort to lies? In addition to this, you must always remember, O king, that God is a lover of the truth." The king received the answer with great delight, and looking at another said, "What is the teaching of wisdom?" And the other replied, "As you wish that no evil should befall you, but to be a partaker of all good things, so that you should act on the same principle towards your subjects and offenders, and you should mildly admonish the noble and good, for God draws all men to himself by his benignity." The king praised him, and asked the next in order how he could be the friend of men. And he replied by observing that the human race increases and is born with much trouble and great suffering, wherefore you must not lightly punish or inflict torments upon them, since you know that the life of man is made up of pains and penalties. For if you would understand everything, you would be filled with pity. For God also is pitiful. The king received an answer with approbation and inquired of the next, "What is the most essential qualification for ruling?" "To keep oneself," he answered, "free from bribery, and to practice sobriety during the greater part of one's life, to honor righteousness above all things, and to make friends of men of this type. For God, too, is a lover of justice." Having signified his approval, the king said to another, "What is the true mark of piety?" And he replied, "To perceive that God constantly works in the universe and knows all things, and no man who acts unjustly and works wickedness can escape his notice. As God is the benefactor of the whole world, so you too must imitate him and be void of offense." The king signified his agreement and said to another, "What is the essence of kingship?" And he replied, "To rule oneself well and not to be led astray by wealth or fame. 2. Immoderate or unseemly desires. This is the true way of ruling if you reason the matter well out. For all that you really need is yours, and God is free from need and benignant withal. Let your thoughts be such as become a man, and desire not many things, but only such as are necessary for ruling." The king praised him and asked another man how his deliberations might be for the best. And he replied, if he constantly set justice before him in everything, and thought that injustice was equivalent to deprivation of life. For God always promises the highest blessings to the just. Having praised him, the king asked the next how he could be free from disturbing thoughts in his sleep. And he replied, "You've asked me a question which is very difficult to answer, for we cannot bring our true selves into play during the hours for sleep." I would disagree with that. But are held fast in these by imaginations that cannot be controlled by reason. Your going to sleep practices are one of the essentials to either protect you from demonic influences or whatever in your sleep, or to direct what occurs in your sleep to a degree. For our souls possess the feeling that they actually see the things that enter into our consciousness during sleep. But we make a mistake if we suppose that we are actually sailing on the sea in boats, are flying through the air, are traveling to other regions, or anything else of the kind, and yet we actually do imagine such things to be taking place. Now, it's not quite the same thing as imagination during when you're awake, fantasizing or something. But it is a sort of reality, but it's not always, don't hold your dreams against other people. You could say, it's like, I had a bad dream about you. It's like, well, sometimes we understand things in dreams that we don't understand in our regular life, but, other than that, so far as it is possible for me to decide, I have reached the following conclusion. You must in every way possible, O king, govern your words and actions by the rule of piety, that you may have the consciousness that you are maintaining virtue, and that you never choose to gratify yourself at the expense of reason, and never by abusing your power do despite to righteousness. For the mind mostly busies itself in sleep with the same things with which it occupies itself when awake. Now that's a lot more amazing than the idea, other conclusion, but yeah. And he who has all his thoughts and actions set toward the noblest ends establishes himself in righteousness, both when he is awake and when he is asleep. Therefore, you must be steadfast in the constant discipline of self. The king bestowed praise on the man and said to another, Since you are the 10th to answer when you have spoken, we will devote ourselves to the banquet. And then he put the question, How can I avoid doing anything unworthy of myself? And he replied, Look always to your own fame and your own supreme position, that you may speak and think only such things as are constant therewith, knowing that all your subjects think and talk about you, for you must not appear to be worse than the actors who study carefully the role which it is necessary for them to play, and to shape all their actions in accordance with it. You are not acting a part, but are really a king, since God has bestowed upon you a royal authority in keeping with your character. When the king had applauded loud and long in the most gracious way, the guests were urged to seek repose. So, when the conversation ceased, they devoted themselves to the next course of the feast. On the following day, the same arrangement was observed, and when the king found an opportunity of putting questions to the men, he questioned the first of those who had been left over for the next interrogation. What is the highest form of government? And he replied, to rule oneself and not to be carried away by impulses. For all men possess a certain natural bent of mind. It is probable that most men have an inclination towards food and drink and pleasure, and kings a bent towards the acquisition of territory and great renown. But it is good that there should be moderation in all things. What God gives, that you must take and keep, but never yearn for things that are beyond your reach. Pleased with these words, the king asked the next how he could be free from envy. And he, after a brief pause, replied, If you consider first of all that it is God who bestows on all kings glory and great wealth, and no one is king by his own power, all men wish to share this glory, but cannot, since it is the gift of God. The king praised the man in a long speech, and then asked another how he could despise his enemies. And he replied, If you show kindness to all men and win their friendship, you need fear no one. To be popular with all men is the best of good gifts to receive from God. Having praised this answer, the king ordered the next man to reply to the question how he could maintain his great renown. And he replied that if you are generous and large-hearted in bestowing kindness and acts of grace upon others, you will never lose your renown. But if you wish the aforesaid graces to continue yours, you must call upon God continually. The king expressed his approval and asked the next, To whom ought a man to show liberality? And he replied, All men acknowledge that we ought to show liberality to those who are well disposed towards us, but I think that we ought to show the same keen spirit of generosity to those who are opposed to us, that by this means we may win them over to the right and to what is advantageous to ourselves. But we must pray to God that this may be accomplished, for he rules the minds of all men. Having expressed his agreement with the answer, the king asks the sixth to reply to the question, "To whom ought we to exhibit gratitude?" And he replied, "To our parents continually, for God has given us a most important commandment with regard to the honor due to parents." In the next place, he reckons the attitude of friend toward friend, for he speaks of a friend which is as thine own soul. You do well in trying to bring all men into friendship with yourself. And with both of those, and with the spouse and the parent, and towards the child too, and towards society, you don't honor people by perpetuating their evil and ignorance. So, there is that exception between, with going along, because honor and going along isn't the same thing. The king spoke kindly to him, and then asked the next, "What is it that resembles beauty and value?" And he said, "Piety, for it is the preeminent form of beauty, and its power lies in love, which is the gift of God. This you have already acquired, and with it all the blessings of life." The king, in the most gracious way, applauded the answer and asked another how, if he were to fail, he could regain his reputation again in the same degree. And he said, "It is not possible for you to fail, for you have sown in all men the seeds of gratitude, which produce a harvest of goodwill, and this is mightier than the strongest weapons, and guarantees the greatest security. But if any man does fail, he must never again do those things which caused his failure, but he must form friendships and act justly. For it is the gift of God to be able to do good actions and not the contrary." Delighted with these words, the king asked another how he could be free from grief. And he replied, "If he never injured anyone, but did good to everybody and followed the pathway of righteousness, for its fruits bring freedom from grief. But we must pray to God that unexpected evils, such as death or disease, or pain, or anything of this kind, may not come upon us and injure us. But since you are devoted to piety, no such misfortune will ever come upon you." Now, that's how we speak in English, I guess, but the negative things in life aren't necessarily evil. So, yeah, that aspect of the so-called problem of evil is lifted up when you realize that these aren't necessarily moral choices. Now, some of that can be the result of certain choices, but the king bestowed great praise upon him and asked the 10th, "What is the highest form of glory?" And he said, "To honor God, and this is done not with gifts and sacrifices, but with purity of soul and holy conviction, since all things are fashioned and governed by God in accordance with his will. Of this purpose you are in constant possession, as all men can see from your achievements in the past and in the present." With a loud voice the king greeted them all and spoke kindly to them. And all those who were present expressed their approval, especially the philosophers, for they were far superior to them, i.e., the philosophers, both in conduct and in argument, since they always made God their starting point. After this, the king, to show his good feeling, proceeded to drink to the health of his guests. Now, especially the philosophers. Pauline Christianity, what's the reference against philosophy? But there's a couple verses in the Bible on the Christian side that would give reason why this letter would not be included based on that bit right there. Chapter 8, verse 8 epitomizes the value of knowledge. Verse 23, parental affection. Note especially the question in verse 26 and the answer. Also note the question in verse 47 and the answer. This is sage advice for businessmen. So chapter 9 is 68 verses. On the following day, the same arrangements were made for the banquet, and the king, as soon as an opportunity occurred, began to put questions to the men who sat next to those who had already responded. And he said to the first, "Is wisdom capable of being taught?" And he said, "The soul is so constituted that it is able by the divine power to receive all the good and reject the contrary." The king expressed approval and asked the next man, "What is it that is most beneficial to health?" And he said, "Temperance, and it is not possible to acquire this unless God create a disposition towards it." The king spoke kindly to the man and said to the other, "How can a man worthily pay the debt of gratitude to his parents?" And he said, "By never causing them pain, and this is not possible unless God dispose the mind to the pursuit of the noblest ends." Now, for those who are under you or in one, you have authority over them in one way or another, what you like, it doesn't cause you pain not to get what you like. What you need, that could be a different story. The king expressed agreement and asked the next how he could become an eager listener. And he said, "By remembering that all knowledge is useful because it enables you, by the help of God, in a time of emergency to select some of the things which you have learned and apply them to the crisis which confronts you. And so the efforts of men are fulfilled by the assistance of God." The king praised him and asked the next how he could avoid doing anything contrary to the law. And he said, "If you recognize that it is God who has put the thoughts into the hearts of the lawgivers, that the lives of men might be preserved, you will follow them." The king acknowledged the man's answer and said to another, "What is the advantage of kinship?" And he replied, "If we consider that we ourselves are afflicted by the misfortunes which fall upon our relatives, and if their sufferings become our own, then the strength of kinship is apparent at once, for it is only when such feeling is shown that we shall win honor and esteem in their eyes. For help, when it is linked with kindliness, is of itself a bond which is altogether indissoluble. And in the day of their prosperity we must not crave their possessions, but must pray God to bestow all manner of good upon them." And having accorded to him the same praise as to the rest, the king asked another how he could attain freedom from fear. And he said, "When the mind is conscious that it has wrought no evil, and when God directs it to all noble counsels." The king expressed his approval and asked another how he could always maintain a right judgment. And he replied, "If he constantly set before his eyes the misfortunes which befall men, and recognized that it is from